this Zoom webinar, or you can also submit the question via the question and answer box. All your questions will be discussed at the end of the session. So please feel free to post your questions. And if you have any queries, you can post it in the chat box or the QA box available in the Zoom. Now, without further delay, let me introduce and let me welcome our panelist, Mr. Mario Brazzoli. He is a human resource business partner at ING. He has over 17 years of experience in roles ranging from business partnering to specialized work in various centers of excellence, with experience across financial services, retail, and telecommunication. He holds a Master in Commerce, specializing in leadership in performance and change. He's passionate about the role of human resources in transforming organizations through modernizing people practices. He was recognized in 2016 with the Human Resource Practitioner of the Year Excellence Award by the Institute for People Management. So I welcome you, Mario, to our webinar. So over to you, Mario.
Thank you so much, Krishna. Thank you for the opportunity. So I think first a warm welcome to everyone and thank you for making the time. I see we've got quite a nice large audience, so really looking forward to the engagement and yeah, a little bit of the Q&A at the end. So looking forward to it. I was just, before we jump into the slides, thinking that last week I had one of my first opportunities to speak in person at an event. And it's actually strange how it's become so common to sit behind the computer when we do these webinars, that it's actually a little bit more comfortable here than standing in front of an audience of 100 or 200. So as the changing times are definitely affecting our perspective on life. But welcome to all and looking forward to the conversation. All right, let's jump into it. So I think first off, to start a little bit about me. And I thought that the easiest way to share my story is to start with my flag. So obviously my name is Mario Brazzoli. And I think that alone gives a little bit of context of my Italian background. And then I think the next flag that gives away my accent is obviously my South African heritage and having the privilege to grow up in South Africa. And then quite interesting, I had the privilege of spending about 3.5, almost 4 years in Egypt and Cairo for parts of my schooling. And then lastly, about 3.5 years ago, made the move to the Netherlands, where I'm now fortunate to have joined ING and a big part of my change. So for all of those online, feel free to share your flags in the comments as we get started. It's also nice to get a feel of how international the group is that is joining us today. All right, on that note, to jump in my journey. So I thought it would be quite nice in the sense of sharing the journey and specifically around the topic of data and the changing role of HR. And I've been quite fortunate across my 17 years with Krishna's kind introduction of taking kind of this journey through HR and how HR has also changed. And I thought maybe just start off and highlight a little bit of some of the key things that I kind of experienced in my own journey. So I normally explain my journey if it's a little bit like this rock formations, in the sense of it's not like a perfect Lego block or brick on top of each other. It's kind of these odd shape experiences that you build up and hopefully balance over a time period. And to kick the story off, is one of my first kind of big experiences was, when I finally got the opportunity to head up an HR department with a company called Reliable Music Warehouse, which was a small retailer, music retailer. And that was kind of my first experience around when we talk about this data topic, about really the integration or the movement from paper to digital. Time period when even us as HR practitioners, we still had various sort of government institutions coming to audit our personnel files, and there was times where keeping our filing up to date in a sense from a paper trail was such a key important part. And it's interesting that that's not that long ago in a sense of how we look at data today, in a sense of it's only a few years ago that we still had to still have everything printed in our filing in our offices. So it's actually quite a large transition for us as practitioners. I think the next step that was quite interesting in my journey was when I joined the JD Group, which was a large international retail group. And there I was quite privileged to run the project for redefining the HR operating model. And this was really the era where a lot of organizations started introducing the David Ulrich model, which we'll talk about a little bit more in depth as we go on. But really, but how do we transform kind of that HR and HR as a unit and how we supply services? So quite an interesting journey at that stage, and we'll unpack it a little bit more when we talk about the David Ulrich model. Then from there, I had the pleasure of moving on to MTN, which is a global telecoms company across Africa and the Middle East that some of you might know. And there, it was also about how do we take that same methodology that's applicable not only to HR, but obviously to other fields in finance and supply chain, etc., but also the complexities that brings. And MTN, we also build a shared services capability that serves across multiple cultures. So also from a data perspective, how do we handle cultural elements inside data? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the trends, but quite interesting in how that evolves. And then my next opportunity, which I want to take a minute on to share a bit of stories, was when I joined ABSA. Originally, it was part of Barclays, the Barclays Africa operation, and then became, again, rebranded as ABSA, which is a banking institution across the African landscape. And one of the wonderful examples, if I think about how data has changed fundamentally our role, here there was an example where we were working with one of the environments called the ceased estates. In other words, how we would process if someone passes away, what you would do with their accounts or the money and or the assets in their account. And in that unit, when we were busy looking at redesigning it and futurizing it and bringing in automation and robotics, one of the magical things that I experienced at that stage was in that unit, we still had individuals that was called typists. In other words, individuals that were physically typing up handwritten notes into to Word for documentation, or in some cases, even still doing manual paper filing. And again, as we're talking about a 2015 kind of time period range, that also talks about, from an HR perspective, it's both about how data is impacting our lives as HR practitioners, but also what the changes within our business environments that we support. And the realization of this digital era and in the age of how and the different kind of competencies we have to build. And in that example is, the sad reality is those individuals that we haven't brought onto that journey then sits part of these digital transformations almost feeling lost in it. For a person who's used to typing up handwritten notes or filing to now have to take up an analytical kind of orientation of a role is quite a significant shift. Then one of the parts that I'm quite proud of is I then took a small stint outside of human resources for about 3 years, where it was quite interesting in the sense of taking a little bit of learnings more from a strategic perspective. So how does the business side interpret how HR, handles data, and how that contributes to our strategy? And they kind of the key learning for me was, how HR ties what we do in our data back to the strategy, in the sense of, besides having data that speaks to the indicators or levers that we want to see, how does it speak about how do we help transform the organization or make impact on the customers and create value for our stakeholders? What then was quite important for me was stepping out of HR for 3 years and then stepping back in. And then I had the pleasure of joining ING, which is quite a unique organization in the sense of really pushing forward around the digital landscape and then the agile workforce kind of mindset and thinking, and quite futuristic in their own right. And obviously stepping back into it really to me was a highlight on how quickly our roles as HR business partners and our roles within the HR community fundamentally shift and continue to shift. And I think over the past year, it's been kind of a big adaptation for me getting back into it, of how the landscape has so fundamentally shifted. So this is a little bit about my story, and I'm hoping I can take some of these experiences and insights and share it with you today. And again, it's my view, and it'd be interesting through the comments and at the end of the questions to hear about your thoughts. And please feel free to connect on LinkedIn and connect afterwards if there's questions you don't want to ask in the session or outside of the session, or just want to connect on some of the topics. That's always welcomed, and it's great to expand our network. So if we go into our topic today, data trends and the changing role of HR, there's kind of 4 key things I would like to discuss. So I think the first thing we have to kind of lay a little bit of a foundation by looking backwards to look forward. So how has the role of HR changed or shifted across the eras? The next is a little bit of an introduction on data science. Again, as you'll see from my background, I have an HR background, so not a data scientist by nature. So I can give you a high level taste of what's inside the world, but we'll at least introduce the concepts just to help us lean onto it. And then I thought it was quite interesting in the sense of how do we unpack data trends within the HR context. And I think the first thing we have to do is look at what is the common HR trends we are seeing in the market. And then we can kind of translate how does data trends impact or drive some of those key trends. And then obviously the final part will try and make that link and hopefully give you some key points to take away and take forward in your journey. So that's what we got in for today. So looking forward to it, and let's then kick off into the discussion. So as mentioned, the first area we'll look at is looking back to look forward, and really looking at what the changing role of human resources is. So I'm sure a picture and a story that you've heard many times, but we'll try and unpack it in a meaningful way. So really looking at the evolution of human resources of where we started. So, here we kind of normally talk about starting around the 19th century, but I mean, I think there's something that starts a little bit earlier for me. One of the kind of magical, sort of things I've learned across time was about a little bit of history of something called a Rendum Novarum, which is basically an open letter that was written by Pope Leo XIII in 1891, I think it was. And what this letter was is kind of the first documented proposal on how to incorporate human relations, and that really talks about he appealed to different environments that the relationship between a worker and an employer should be something open to the worker and employer being able to negotiate or to discuss. And I think it's actually quite nice that where some of our base principles started is that kind of open interaction and really having an employer and employee kind of an open, trusted relationship on how it goes. Obviously, our story starts in the 19th century, so it's a little bit harsher than that. So that's normally the age period we talk about from more agricultural kind of relationships and a time period of masters and apprenticeships. That kind of leads us to the next step of around the 1920s, where we speak often about the concept of the welfare officer, where really the integration of how do we look at the welfare of the workforce, maybe from wages, administration, housing, healthcare. And a big driver of this was the introduction of unions and collective labor movements on driving fair labor environments that obviously changed that landscape. The next, we look at the 1960s, which really then moves on to psychological. So here again, looking from an HR role perspective, kind of changing from that welfare officer to more personnel departments. And I think of some of you that are as grey as I am on the call might remember still departments being called personnel departments or manpower at a stage. If I think about how undiverse the system was back in the 60s. But again, as this was a time period where we looked at collective agreements, but also about how do we kind of make that link between how does job satisfaction lead to productivity. So this was really the time period where we evolved in looking at how does a happier workforce become a more productive workforce. It also was a time period about the introduction of women in the workplace and how we adapt to that. But still we saw a lot of kind of post-Second World War military kind of systems in the HR departments and how we looked at structure and looking at devising and addressing things. So the next kind of stage talks about the 2000s. Here it's really, which I think is quite a nice concept, and it's about how HR looks beyond administrative and compliance. In other words, how do we look at value creation? So here we also saw a lot of movement around standardization across national and international standards. I think it's something quite relevant today, where we're seeing a lot more standardization or impacts across the globe, and not just from a local or national level. This also was a time period where we had to look at individuals more in a social, psychological perspective, in the sense of how we create meaning and how we create meaning within an environment and identity, and look at cultural variances within environments. And then obviously I think what we're going to be talking about a little bit more today is typically where the data and the data sphere is now influenced around the 2020s. And this could also be I think an accelerated concept due to COVID and what hybrid workforce has meant for us. But this is really a time period about what does AI and machine learning and predictive analysis really mean to us, and how is that impacting the changing role of human resources. So I think first to take a step back in the sense of going back to about 1995, if I remember correctly, of when David Ulrich's HR model was introduced. But it's also one of the base way of thinking about human resources and the role of human resources. And here kind of Dave Ulrich shaped the model and saying is there's four key kind of roles that human resources play. So typically, if we look on the axis, the strategic partner that kind of looks at the future and kind of from a process perspective. And here it was really about how to ensure success of the business. How do we link HR strategy and business strategy? And how do we revise system processes to serve the employee and the customer and stakeholders in a better way? On the right-hand side, we look at the change agent in the sense of how do we drive and manage transformation and change? How do we ensure that we have the capacity for change within an organization, which is a key role from an HR perspective. In the bottom left is the old favorite, is the administration expert. That's the day-to-day operations. How do we manage costs? How do we build cost-efficient infrastructure? It helps us drive it. On the right-hand side, I think an element that's popping up more and more in the modern era of how important is that employee champion. And this really talks about the happier and healthier employee and what that means. Also talks about our ability to listen to the workforce and translate that back into meaning. And ultimately, how do we increase employee commitment and capability? And you'll see some kind of key goals or drivers of what his model really tried to identify in the sense of how do we build or create high functioning environments? How do we define roles within an HR department, being in mind as our traditional way of thinking about an HR administrator, HR officer, HR manager, and HR director is something that wasn't relevant anymore in the sense of we had to be able to play these four different roles in different environments. And then obviously, ultimately, how does this measure? So I think this model is kind of the first base of it, and this kind of translated into our concept of how do we create centers of excellence to really kind of look at the strategic partner perspective, shared services capability that spoke more about our administrative effort, and then really about the HR business partner role that spoke about the change agent and employee champion and that capability and how that kind of evolved. And that really comes from the fundamental way of how we really looked at HR as an organization and a structure. And then to take it to the next journey, which I thought was quite interesting, is talking about Dave Ulrich, is also the adaptation of the book. So in 1997, he published the book Human Resources Champions, which was him sharing the refined roles and obviously how HR can have that impact on both the employee and the customer. Then later on in 2005, he published the book, the HR, the Value Proposition. And this was really about, besides changing our roles, how do we translate that back into a value proposition? And what I found interesting here was really breaching it about how do we turn it into value for all stakeholders. So if you think about the earlier thinking of HR in a sense of how do we play the role in partnering with leaders, to later on about how do we create that welfare for employees, and in addition to that, how do we create it for ultimately stakeholders or shareholders? And here also branched the fact that HR can also have a direct link on the customer. And I think that really started forming or thinking a little bit more of a role about how do we play a broader role within the organization. We don't just touch internal stakeholders, but we actually reach external stakeholders through what we do. The next was the HR competencies in 2008. And this really talked about how do we deliver change and create a shift in knowledge, a shift in skills, shift in abilities, and specifically about how do we create shifts in mindsets, both within HR and across the organization. Later that year, obviously, the introduction of the HR transformation, which I think was one of the kind of nice shifts in the sense of really looking at it from both the internal and external perspective. So here we saw, besides the fact of HR playing a key role in helping the organization transform, it was also about how does HR transform itself. And I think post 2009, I mean, it also kind of latched onto my own story in the sense of how we started changing internal HR departments and transformed HR service delivery models. This was really the time period when we saw leaps and movements in how HR departments were set up or created or established. Then next I think, was the idea of HR from the outside in. And yeah, if you think about where we kind of positioned it from the previous book from HR Transformation, this was really about how do we first fix HR before we can go and help business fix HR. And I think it was kind of an interesting time period in the sense of how do we really kind of evolve our own shared service capability, or how do we really get our centers of excellence to think to the future? And how do we really, as HR business partner, have more meaningful impact and relationships with business and the leaders that we partner with? And then, interesting enough, I think one of my favorite books is quite recently in 2017, where Victory Through Organization. And this is the concept about really looking at the way that we think about skills or competence and roles, and start thinking about it in a sense of organizational capability. And it fits in so nicely with today's conversation that if you think about data or data management as an organizational capability, in the sense that an organization can differentiate itself through its ability to manage, deal with, analyze, and add value through data. And here, good examples of organizations is, for example, like a Uber, in the sense of what Uber is able to do with the quantum of data they have and how they can differentiate themselves in the market. So I think from an HR perspective and our role of rethinking and really looking at how we look at core things in a sense from a capability perspective, an organizational capability perspective, than merely a skill or a attitude or a behavior or a capability or ability, as an example. Then what I thought a part of this conversation was I looked at Gartner's view on the future of the HR operating model. And I mean, I think in this picture, we kind of see some key things that are similar to what we see today, in the sense of how we think of the COE, the shared services, and the HR business partner role. But they highlighted some key shifts here for us in how we kind of see the division between it. And I think the first was really reinventing the HR business partner role to a perspective of what they refer to as a strategic talent leaders. And here it's really about how do we redefine that role and strip out the parts that don't add value there. I think many HR business partners in their current capacity will still tell you there's way too much administrative and those kind of tasks inside of their day-to-day work to really add value here. And the idea is to really have this kind of level or range kind of fit that positioning of talking or dealing with the most pressing talent opportunities and challenges. It also having a real holistic view of the strategy of the business and the talent needs. And often we talk about moving the deck chairs, but here it's really playing the key role to partner with business about making sure we have the right people at the right challenges from a leadership perspective to help drive change within the organization. The next tier that they obviously spoke about is the HR problem solvers, which I think is such a nice introduction as a concept that could potentially in future grow. And this is really about how do we strip out the concept of special projects or special issues. So I think, you know, we've been talking more and more lately about the talent challenges or the war on talent. So how do we strip out key individuals to help or work at a specific challenge or to help us solve a specific problem to do that? And again, there could be cross-functional type of HR skills, but this gives a much broader kind of ability on handling those exceptions, where normally you would have the same individual trying to partner with businesses and at the same time address some of these real global or challenging situations. So splitting that strategic and HR problem-solving capability. Next, we talk about really looking at the next generation COEs. It's something I can also personally relate. I had the pleasure of working in a talent center of excellence, and later MTN also an organizational development center of excellence. And here it's really about how do we take out the operational work that typically sits there. You know, oftentimes it also speaks about the uneven demands that sits on centers of excellence between different parts of work or between different businesses. And the natural challenge is that over time, unfortunately, some of our COEs are becoming misaligned with the business strategy. So how do we bring that future thinking of where HR is going, or what kind of tools and mechanisms we need to build it? How do we bring that back to alignment with the business challenges and what we need from a business perspective? And then the last imperative that they kind of mentioned, I think this is also talked so heavily to our data conversation, is the robustness of this kind of chief operating officer or this kind of operation mechanism that sits behind all of that. And that really talks about where we're seeing the involvement of chatbots, of shared services, and really about how do we take data analytics and insights from that to a new level, obviously underpinned by great technology that can help us drive that. And here, typically, we talk about people-first HR technology in the sense of how do we really bring out the people voice or the human aspect out of our HR technology. But also what I like here is the people relations manager. Oftentimes with these centers of excellence and so on, we feel that we have a losing touch of a personal touch that gets missing in the process. And oftentimes we process that back by bringing that back into the HR business partner part, which obviously we want to try and keep away from a more strategic perspective and level. So I think quite interesting insights on some views on what we could see with the changing role in the future HR operating models and how that could be adapting and how we're looking differently at that as time goes on. So some interesting insights. All right, so our next session goes into what is data science, and I actually have the privilege of partnering with some incredibly smart people at IMG, and one of the areas is of absolute specialists in this area. So I'm sure I will get lots of comments at some stage about my own understanding in comparison to people who are absolute gurus on this. But I mean, again, I think that's the first fundamental shift that we've seen over the years is data has become a data science. So it's become a science, become a field on its own with its own weight and really something, if I think from a consideration and a cross-play, really critical to us. But just to give a small little definition on what it is or what it means, and it's really is about how do we record, store, and analyze it to create insight. And this obviously talks to both unstructured and structured kind of data flows. So what does that exactly mean? So I thought these are the kind of 4 fundamental blocks that kind of represent what data science is, and I think what the value that it can create within the various fields. And one is about how do we turn data into information. And this is really about, I think we're in a time period where we amass enormous amount of data, but oftentimes it's not in a format or a way or a structure or a hierarchy or architecture that we can actually interpret it or take meaning of it. And that obviously talks to the next step about how are we able then to analyze the data to get real insight from and things that we can actually adapt or do from it. Next is typically what we really want to see about this is how do we identify trends, patterns, and correlations from that. And this brings it back so much for me to even from an HR perspective in the sense of we have all this employee data and we have all this base information, but how do we from that really get insight into trends, patterns, and correlations, both from perspective of seeing or predicting the future, but also having a clear understanding of what is happening within our space. And that really kind of brings it to the large pillar that's so important is really about conceptualizing, applying, and understanding them. So how do we conceptualize data? How do we apply data or data practices within our different environments? And how do we really make a sense of it and understand it for how we use it? So that's a little bit of an introduction of data science. And I think just to take it a little bit further is the little bit of the history on it. And apologies to the audience, but I'm an absolute history buff in the sense love kind of the backstories of how things evolved. And when digging into more about the role that data plays and kind of a story, it's always interesting to see a little bit about how that journey is. And the journey really starts, with quite the scary sentiment that, in the 19th century BC, we really saw the kind of the first recordings and something called the Issango bone, which holds the first evidence. So it basically is as a mammal bone with different markings on it that obviously I think historians are still debating what exactly the markings mean, but it was our first kind of indication of the recording of information. And I think from a data perspective, it's also important to understand is the fundamental basis, how do we record information? And this was the first evidence of collecting and storing of information. The next is a gentleman around the 16th century, John Garnet, that introduced a memorandum at that stage called the Observations. And this is actually a very interesting backstory. During the time period, he collected death records from various London parishes and made observations from those various records. And from those records, he could determine, for example, or indicate what the various death rates were between different genders, but also later on predict life expectancies. And I think that's so fascinating. I mean, if you think about this, is now we're talking about the 16th century, and isn't this still what we're trying to do today, in the sense of interpreting data, get other words meaning from it, and have predictive ability of it. And to think about this is how long ago the base concepts of the interpretation started. The next is quite a nice story from Herman Ulrich, which is obviously associated with the US census of 1890. And the storyline really goes about, there was a tender out about different individuals pitching on a mechanized way of recording census data. So obviously, when you are counting mass amount of ballots or different inputs, how do you kind of make sense of it? So the first exercise was, they kind of timed between these different observations or different contestants, how long it would take to capture the data from 3 states in the US. And, the first contestant, it roughly took 144 hours. The second was over 100 hours. And Herman's mechanism was able to process it in 72 hours. So, I mean, that feels like, yes, that's a good 30-40% reduction, but not significant. But what was quite interesting was the next stage of the exercise is, once we recorded the data, how do we put it into information? So the next part of the exercise was to categorize the data or this information pieces into either age, gender, or something of that nature, where the other contestants roughly took about 45 hours and 56 hours to categorize either by age or by gender or something of that nature, and where his mechanism was able to do it in 5 hours. So that's quite a significant reduction in the sense of from capturing the data to taking analysis. And that became a fundamental building block to how we look at data, capture data, in other words, how do we turn that back into meaning. So the next is 9th century, that's really, put around how do we store data. And here we saw the introduction of magnetic tapes that obviously later also inspired the floppy disk. I don't know if there's enough people with gray hair on the call that still remember the floppy disk and the hard disk. That feels like many years ago, where you had to be careful with this loose data storage thing, and if you held it wrong, you wipe out all the data on the floppy disk before you can put it in your computer. And this was kind of the first mechanism on how we store data. And I mean, I think this translates later to Philips and their design of the CD and that kind of capability. So kind of a fundamental point for us. And if we want to interpret larger data, how are we able to store it and use it? And then I think last in that kind of storyline is really Tim Byrne's introduction of the World Wide Web. I think it's still such a crazy idea as the man that invented the internet, right? I mean, such a fundamental part of the ship in our lifetime. And I think for those of us born prior to 1990, we experienced that shift and the mind-blowing experience of what that meant from an interconnectivity perspective and a change in life. So obviously, he did the first work on the first browser that could run protocols and algorithms to help searches and browsers across a web or across servers. So really fundamental and a fundamental shift. So just to take this a little bit more to the modern era. So I think that was the previous story was a little bit more for those of you that are grey like me, but maybe put it more in the modern kind of context. So the first around the 2000s, we saw the big boom around the .coms. And I think some of us have to think far ago to kind of remember this. But what the massive impact on this was from a data perspective is how it was mass movement of companies going online. And here, I think that fundamentally started changing the landscape, because a part of companies or organizations going online was the kind of digitizing of data and data kind of capability. The next, we saw a big shift in a sense of service industries transforming customer service through improving data. And here we kind of see the Netflix stories and the Amazon stories in the sense of how they fundamentally changed how we service customer by improving how they interpret or manage or handle data and data flows. And here it could be predictive in a sense of how we know what you want, but also in a sense of capturing information and dealing with it. So the next is, if we think about the 2010s, here we saw the Airbnbs and the Ubers, and this was really about what smartphones brought to our lives in the session of in the era of on-demand economy. And here it was really about faster moving. It's something that we can access immediately. It's not something we have to pre-order. And that had a big impact in the sense of the speed of data flow and the need for interactions. So we think back to the previous slide in the sense of how long, the 5.5 hours for categorizing information versus what we need in the modern era and the capability behind understanding and being able to interpret that data. Next up, around 2015s, this is really, I think, leading into a big part of some of the aspects we'll chat about today, which talks about the introduction, obviously, of machine learning and AI, and what that meant from a mainstream perspective, and also the intensified, capability from processing information, speeded up our ability to deal with data, handle data, and make meaning of it, which created an additional shift in how we look at the data and that interchange of it. And then lastly, I think what is really important is what the last couple of years meant for us, the intensification of verbal adoption. And I kind of mentioned when I opened the presentation was, the fact that it's become almost the norm, or it's become almost more comfortable sitting behind a screen doing a webinar instead of sitting in front of an audience of 200, 300 individuals speaking to them directly. And again, proof of how, this last kind of 2-3 years and the concept of flexible and hybrid work, what that has meant as well for how we look at data, look at practices, but also, more importantly, how we translate that back and what that means from a HR perspective or human resources perspective. So lastly, thinking about data and data sciences, what does it mean? What does it look like? How do we make this real and tangible? So what does actual solutions look like? So obviously from a banking perspective, this plays a massive role in our ability to address anomalies. So this could be either fraud, but we see it typically in other environments where, from a disease perspective or crime perspective, data science and their capability really allows us to detect anomalies at a fast pace, moving through various kind of data sets. We're also seeing a major change in automation decision making. Obviously, the speed in the sense of background checks, creditworthy checks, and what we're able to do in that sense. We spoke about classification. And yeah, I think one of the most wonderful examples of data science is just our ability to, for a system to decide between what's an important email and a junk email in your inbox, and showing how something as practical as that in our daily lives is something driven through data science. Next, we talk about forecasting, is obviously the predictive ability and how we can forecast as well from a customer retention, sales, or revenue perspective. Lastly, is pattern. So we talk about weather patterns, financial market patterns. I mean, this is critical to our current state, which I also find fascinating is around the idea of how data science can play a role for us from a facial, voice, text recognition perspective. Obviously, the speed in the sense of interpreting, categorizing, and making meaning out of various data points from a picture, from a face, or from a voice strain. And lastly, in the sense of, again, as recommendation engines that refer us to movies, restaurants, or books. It's fascinating how you get emails nowadays where a system has recommended 2 new books based on what you've read, or recommended a song. I saw now on my phone, in a sense of music, in a sense where I have my own radio station that, depending on the music that I listen to, that the software actually now puts a playlist together that's accustomed to the kind of music I want. And this is the kind of application that data science brings to our world. All right, so that takes us through a little bit of data science and what that means. So let's speak a little bit about HR trends and where HR is going, and then we can try and see if we can tie what data science is and what it means back into how that's impacting our roles. And we'll try and unpack this piece by piece. So the first is we're seeing quite a big shift now around fairness and equity, really becoming top priorities, and also the impact of what hybrid workforces does from a D&I, obviously a diversity and inclusion perspective, what it does to our efforts. So here, the first kind of takeaways of what's fundamentally changing is around narrative creation and speaking about the HR's role in a sense of helping organization change or adapt or turn this into storylines and narratives for the organization to understand, But also what it talks about here, which is quite important, is about using data points, but in addition, non-data points to drive arguments to help line managers adapt to this changing environment in a sense of how they deal with fairness and equity. The next, we talk about employee listening. So here we see a big shift in the sense from, moving away from large employee engagement surveys to more sort of pulse checks. So faster moving data collection, really seeking out real-time feel of how colleagues are feeling or experiencing something. So it's really about the speed of how do we get information and interpret it versus, your typical surveys that takes us 3 or 4 months from when we send it out to have data that we can interpret and use and have impact on the organization. And I think a part of that listening is really about how do we really enable ourselves as Asia practitioners to help play a role in, addressing kind of acute fairness challenges by listening in the workforce. And again, as I think back to the Ulrich model in the sense of that employee champion, how do we really reinforce that role about being able to pick up the signs and the cues within the organization on addressing transparency and fairness and equity. And lastly, internal mobility, and I think this is such a nice aspect in the sense of where there's more weight, and obviously the trend we're seeing is significant more transparency required from how we recognize people, how we promote people, pay discretion. So, here we always mocked about, wouldn't it be an ideal world? I think every HR practitioner would love to be able to print out the payroll and stick it up on a notice board to really indicate or show that practices or pay practices is that equal, that fair, and being able to rationalize it. But I mean, that's the kind of level of transparency that we're heading into. And that's kind of one of the key trends we're seeing, that people want to see that kind of transparency in how we make hiring or promotion decisions, how we make decisions about who do we recognize, etc. So really interesting trend, and nice to see that we really pushing the dials on fairness and transparency. The next I found quite interesting, employee trade hours for pay. And this also talks a little bit about our hybrid workforce and how flexibility has really changed the way we look at the workforce and the environment. And here, I think the first talks about experimental design in the sense of us as HR playing a different role in the sense of how do we create real return on investment for more flexibility. I think we have a fundamental role to play to keep flexibility in the workforce and keep this movement driving of what we're seeing with the hybrid workforces and the change. Next is typically kind of connected to that is we're playing a very deeper role in the sense of business case generation, but also how data is becoming a critical point in the sense of how we translate things into business cases. And really, we're seeing data-driven business cases instead of concepts. So that's quite an important shift for us. And then lastly, outcome-driven performance management. And again, I think a topic we could probably talk about for hours. If I think about in the past, we've led back to, we look at from a more behavioral. Originally we looked at the what someone did, in other words, the inputs. And later on, we wanted to consider more of the how. We looked a bit more about the behavioral aspects. And now it's really about looking at the output driven. As people want more flexibility, we really need to look at what is produced versus what goes into it versus all the behavior necessarily of it as we create more flexibility, hybrid environments. And this is also fundamentally changing that need from what we record from a performance capability. Next up, we look at hybrid drives more turnover. And I think for a lot of the HR practitioners on the call, I think turnover for us has probably been one of the hot topics over the last 2 years, as we're seeing great talent kind of wars across the globe and finding specific skill sets in different environments. But here again, I think it starts with the employee journey mapping, and this is a concept I really like. Similar to what we would do in a business context and for serving a customer. We would do the customer journey mapping, where we create different personas for different customers and how we service or how different personas of customers experience it. Similar to this, we need to do the same in the HR concept. So maybe just to spend a couple of minutes on that. So that persona typically would be, for example, is how we attract, for example, a 20-year-old individual with economics or a physics kind of background versus how we would attract more senior individuals with long tenure histories. So the idea is really to create a persona on what is that person, or what are the characteristics of that individual or that group of individuals, and then relating it back to our employee journey. So does a 18, 19 or 20-year-old experience the employee journey differently to a 30-year-old or something of that nature? And again, does our kind of feels like our marketing sales environments feel a different employee journey than more our, I would say, kind of hardcore environments like the quantitative environments or the data analytic environments? Is it different personas that experience our same employee journeys, and how do we adapt those employee journeys to handle these different personas and really to look at it from those different lenses? I think this is really going to be something that drives a lot of our shift and movement. And also, we're talking data today. Key driver for us is data collection and analysis. Even if we think of something like turnover in a sense of how do we get better information to understand and ultimately also to predict it. And then when we tie the employee journey to this story, is how do we understand labor turnover from a data perspective more from these different personas? So in other words, the storyline associated with us losing 22-year-olds versus individuals in their 50s or their 40s might be significantly different and require different adaptations. So how are we analyzing, how are we collecting, how are we classifying, interpreting that data in different forms to have different impact? And then that naturally talks about the rebalancing of our employee value proposition, in a sense that it's not one size fits all. How do we adapt our employee value proposition, and how do we make it more human? And I think in this era where more of us are spending a lot of time behind the computers working, and a little bit more disassociated, where a lot of the value proposition spoke about things of lunches at the office and coffee machines or the building where you go to, we have to fundamentally rethink how we create value proposition and how we connect people in this kind of hybrid kind of environment. It really challenges us to rethink some of the fundamentals on what a value proposition is and how we need to create and shift that for our workforce. All right, next topic, which I also think is another fascinating one. I mean, it talks about the deceased estates example that I gave you, is that this automation is also driving changes for what managers or line managers play. So I think the first talks a little bit about the scoping of the role and how we scope line manager roles. And here I find it interesting in the sense that what we're seeing is a lot more classical management functions are being automated, or the functionality or the things that management would have done. And again, a lot of those things now become through self-service. So what we're seeing a shift here too is that really taking line manager or management functions back to how do we create more empathy in those roles to create kind of meaningful working environment? How do we bring back the human management aspect of those line manager concepts? And this also requires us to build new competencies within that line, where this is not necessarily about driving quite hard task-focused aspects. This is really going to be more about how do we drive people and people elements and kind of seeing that shift. And then lastly, quite interesting around the revamp of successor mapping. This also talks about really looking at how do we look at what that need shift is from a more human perspective. So we talk about more human leadership and how do we craft that, shape that, and also build successors for our roles with more human leadership capability, and also linking that to the priorities and how do we combine that and get the most meaning out of that. All right, next up, we'll talk about the hybrid tech becomes performance technology. So here, a lot of data aspects starts playing a key. And the first, I think, talks about data ethics. And here is fundamentally, even from an HR perspective, we're seeing larger and larger amount of data, larger data tracks coming to play, and what that means for us and how we interpret it. But with that also comes a lot of constraints. Even if I think of within a European context, we have the GDPR, and obviously across the globe, we've got different variances of that in the sense of how do we protect privacy and what are the rule sets around data and how we use it. And oftentimes that becomes almost slightly a challenge in the sense of how we translate data then into analytics while keeping an ethical eye on it. But this also talks about the fact that fundamentally from an HR perspective, we also play a role in keeping data ethics. So this really requires us to move into a world where we increase our own data understanding or fluency in how we can speak about or understand or interpret the data needs. And I think no great example was, I think 2 or 3 years ago, there was the in the US Parliament kind of interviewing Facebook and seeing the Facebook founder having to explain fundamental concepts to the individuals that are scrutinizing what Facebook has done around data and data influences. And sometimes I feel that, we got to be careful as HR that we don't become the same in the sense of we're going to have data scientists having to explain to us why certain actions are unethical or against the values of the organization. So data fluency and I understand is really important here, and our ability, again, is looking at data fluency. And it talks about that cultural combination or integration into data. How do we ensure that how we unpack data and turn it into meaning has a cultural awareness of it or fairness in it, that we don't inherently do analysis or translate data into a way that creates or creates unfairness or biased or something of that nature. Next, around change management, again, is really looking of what the purpose behind what we're doing. So the purpose of our new tools. So I think that's really, really a kind of key point. Also, the awareness of tools. I think from a change management perspective, we also need to look about, are people aware of the capabilities that are around them from a tools or a self-service or those kind of capabilities. Oftentimes we find individuals lost purely because they're not aware of what is available to them. So how do we make that cleaner and more simpler for people to consume? And then I think what's also important here is around how do we implement this with an employee voice? So how do we implement changes in technology, specifically people technology, while keeping an employee voice part of that implementation journey? And then lastly, around performance, again, I think this is really, really interesting in the sense of how the convergence of technology has fundamentally shifted how much data we actually have or inputs we have for performance management systems. And how do we use that width of input and aspects to fundamentally challenge what we consider as important and how we change that for the future. All right, next up we've got I think one that I thought was quite interesting in the sense from wellness becomes the newest metric, obviously, while sitting becomes the new smoking. And thinking from sitting behind the screen and looking at the length of our meetings, how sitting is becoming the new challenge from a health perspective for our workforce, and how do we adapt and deal with it as it goes on. So I think the first again talks about how do we deal with passive and proxy data to create more return on investment, and how do we use also data to address skeptical line managers. And I think that's still a real challenge for us. How do we bring the wellness concept more and more and make it more real for leaders and line managers to understand the impact and what's necessary there? Then obviously talk about manager training. How do we build the skills and enable managers to become stewards of employee wellness? And this is really an essential kind of, I think, a trend we're seeing and a real need within an organization. And then again, back to that employee. Yeah, I thought there was some really fascinating things that what we're seeing is about, how do we address, for example, the sitting disease that we're kind of seeing at the moment? How do we translate that into, for example, walking meetings? I mean, fundamentally, this requires us from a leadership perspective and also an HR perspective to build different capability and competence within both our staff and our leadership to address that, and also address that from an employee lifecycle journey. Talks about how do we deal with the continuous movement of people interacting differently and interacting more virtually. And then obviously as flexibility becomes permanent, that really requires us to think about some of these fundamental aspects in a very different way as we progress. And then the last kind of HR trend that I want to share is, and again, is Yeah, I think this is very interesting in the sense of the rise of the chief people officer. Again, I've seen these trends over the last 10 years where we have a new chief officer for all the new buzzwords. And this has had similar kind of aspects, but it does hold some truth in a sense of, even from an HR role perspective, how do we play a greater role in the sense of creating purpose for both in the organization, but specifically for employees as they go through these journeys? So, the first is obviously naturally around the employee listening in the sense of how do we really listen in the sense from a social and a cultural perspective, but also where does the role that organizations play from a social and cultural debates perspective? So obviously we're seeing various kind of debates across the globe of different things popping up. We're seeing a big movement around how people would like to identify, the he kind of she versus the they kind of principles. And where does organizations play? Bearing in mind is how do we listen, engage it with our workforce? And how do we understand what employee sentiments are towards that? Here we're also seeing, in a sense, from employees' expectations around emerging issues. So, taking, for example, the recent Russia-Ukraine situation or incident, what is the expectations of employees to organizations on how they would like organizations to take a stance, or the organizations they are part of to take a stance? And what does it mean not taking a stance? If I think of, 10, 15 years ago, one of the fundamental answers we would give to these situations is, well, that's a social or social political, we don't talk about those kind of things within the workplace. We now it's becoming a fundamental part of, sharing or understanding what employee sentiment is, and organizations having to take a stance on it. And I think in the Russia-Ukraine situation, we've seen a lot of organizations take a stance, and that's actually quite a large shift from what we've seen in the past across it. So yeah, so obviously from a network perspective, also about how do we involve employees more in the sense of creating that sentiment and connect them to the purpose and how we evolve purpose across that board. All right, so that was 7 key trends that we're seeing across human resources and what that might mean to our world. So I think now the most critical point is how do we bring this all back in a sense of how do we take what we see in the data perspective to what we're seeing from the HR trends, and what does that mean for our role from a human resources perspective? So the first one is the shift from big data to small data. And I kind of feel this is such a little bit of an oxymoron in the sense of it's counterintuitive of what we also read, right? Because we're reading more and more stuff about big data, and how important it is and how we can do more with data, and our processing power enables us to do more with the data. But what we're also seeing here is the fact that data is becoming smaller because we need to be more specific in what we do. So in other words, this is not about collecting as much as you can. This is about collecting more precise kind of information. So here we kind of look at, well, what does that mean in a data context? So here most organizations, again, only scratch the surface of the data available to them. So it's also about efficiency perspective. And if you think of the data journeys from a storage perspective, is we pay high cost for storing large amount of data that we keep, but we only scratch the surface when we talk about usability. So here, when we talk about data-centristic kind of models, we're really talking about models in the sense of being precise, in the sense of what are the key data we need and how do we translate that into insight. So we also minimize how much we need to hold and store. And then, the whole concept about small and wide data, I think this is really interesting about really looking at what is essential for it. So to translate that into kind of from an HR perspective, what are we seeing here? Shift from people analytics to data literacy. And this is really fundamental for us as HR practitioners, and about how do we build data literacy for ourselves. And I mean, a great example I would think about here is, as an HR business partner, you might sit in a position where you have 9 or 12 different HR reports that you need to look at to take meeting and almost create a one-slider to bring back to your business to drive value within the organization. So, how do we simplify this to say, well, what are the key information? Because on one side, we want more and wider information, but on the other side, we want very specific dials and very specific models to help us make decisions and influence business decisions. Also, so that also talks about the refining of essential data sources. And then most fundamentally here is really about how do we protect data. The larger data we keep and we hold, the harder it becomes to protect that data. and to protect privacy of the data. And I think data protection is going to become a kind of a fundamental part of, or more from a compliance perspective, that's going to drive a lot of our decisions as we go forward. So these three aspects really have a fundamental shift in the sense of how do we look at less to achieve more? How do we really protect that data that we keep and what we see as essential to really inform the decisions that we make going forward? So next up, talking about data-driven customer experience. And here, you can see the comment as well from Jeff Bales, where it really is about using data and the data interactions to create kind of the party for the customer. And again, that rates exactly the same from employee experience. But just to take a moment to say, well, what does that mean from a data context perspective? So obviously, I think during the COVID period, I think universally we're seeing a mass increase in investment in data management across organizations. And that's fundamentally shifting and changing the kind of landscape. We're also seeing the mainstream use of artificial intelligence, chatbots, cashierless convenience stores, an increase in personalized services, which is fundamentally shifting and changing the landscape. So again, what does that mean for us from an HR perspective? So again, it's from the model perspective, it adapts the different roles we have in different ways. So on one side, from a more shared services kind of capability, we're seeing the advancements of HR chatbots. And I think a personal observation from my side is, I think of before I left for kind of 3 years out of HR and returning, is seeing the evolution of HR chatbots and seeing the outcome of what machine learning does in the back end of chatbots, how we're seeing chatbots evolve as they're maturing within organizations. So naturally, they go through a learning cycle of getting use or making more connections between automated questions and replies, and how this is evolving and really becoming a lot more powerful. But it also, that learning timeline also indicates to us what we'll see and how behind the trend organizations that don't use it will start getting, because introducing it, you're going to have to go through the same kind of journey from learning it and translating it over time, specific to your environment, to your policies, to your processes, and those kind of capabilities. And then I think what's quite important here is also about how do we translate this into employee experience data, right? I mean, it's something we don't often see is about organizations being able to take various people indicators and relay it back into a employee experience where we can see where the employee experience is broken or not working based on specific dials, almost like a robot or like a traffic indication, where we can see where there's certain roadblocks or challenges or constraints. So here, this kind of capability where we're seeing all the mainstream work around in artificial intelligence, etc., and machine learning, it really allows us the ability, and what's really going to start becoming important is how do we use that to identify key blockages in our employee experience with all those personas and that kind of trend that we're seeing within the HR space. All right, next up, the big convergence. So I remember reading this thinking this is quite fundamental, and I think it's such a nice quote behind it from the Indian Prime Minister about how this it's so fundamental in the sense of how technology and the conversion of technology can also play a role in creating unity and kind of one mission, one nation. I think that's just shows the kind of impact that this has the potential of doing. So again, from a data context perspective, is how technologies are fueling digital transformation. There's obviously the advancements of stuff like Internet of Things and cloud computing, and what that means from a digital perspective, digital transformation perspective, and our speed on it. And then I think that the fascinating thing that we will fundamentally require us to rethink about is the whole concept of smart. So smart homes, smart cars, smart offices, healthcare, factories, and even cities. I know in South Africa, they're now piloting the first smart township. So talk about a social perspective, and that's fundamentally, but I mean, even in our homes nowadays, how much of our appliances has a sort of smart capability connected to it and interact either between different functions or with itself. And that fundamentally changes, if I think of it from a workplace perspective as well. So here again, our role on digital transformation And if we think about those first slides where we shared the books of HR and HR's role, and one of the core roles that we have is the business is looking at us on how to help build the capability for change, but also about how do we help drive organizational change. And this kind of role and continuous drive for digital transformation is more and more going to become a fundamental part of where we play and how we can add value, and how we bring about that change and build the change capabilities within the organization. And again, from this concept is heavily data driven, or aspects of the data world, maybe from a smart perspective, or just the absolute convergence of these different technologies. And here we see different kind of examples of it, right? I mean, we recently saw the Amazon hiring algorithm that was challenged because of bias. We saw something similar with Salesforce a while back. And again, is, you know, from an HR perspective, how do we manage or deal with this? This is new to us in the sense of technology is helping us source through thousands of CVs to pick shortlists. And if those systems or algorithms indicate biasm, how do we deal with it? How do we adapt it? How do we interface with it? Uber's facial recognition app is a great example of where there's been allegations around a sort of ethical discrimination. So again, is, you know, what does these technologies bring and different challenges it brings to our world? You know, these are going to be key fundamental things we're going to have to govern or look around about how do we again create that fairness and equity and transparency. And again, it's thinking about how as HR do we start molding business to be transparent about the algorithm they use. I mean, just if you think about that as a pure concept, the kind of data kind of fluency it requires from us to be able to translate that and be part of the debate. And then again, it's, you know, even the Salesforce stuff is evolving. Their Einstein AI capability that's quite globally quite famous in a sense of how this can also be used to help us identify bias. You know, imagine more AI to technology in this sense of helping us identify biases, you know, within pay, within different processes or hiring processes, promotions or recognition. I mean, what this kind of means for us in the sense of automating or using this technology to help us address some of these key trends we're seeing within the organization is fundamentally moving and shifting some of our dials. The next is it's one of those I get excited about and feel scared about at the same point was no-code machine learning and AI. So just talking about it from a data perspective. So here it's really about, creating machine learning applications using drag and drop visual interfaces. In other words, you're creating kind of preset coding that can be used in a way of, easy usable. So you have a person that can create machine learning applications without understanding any code by using more visualized kind of technology. So again, it's what does this mean? I also think in the sense of we've been preaching, and I mean, recently I heard about a massive investment, I think it was in Ghana, around developing, or I think it was Kenya, that developing amount of coders for the future. But also what it means is that how the changing times is, how are you using stuff like AI and machine learning to almost take repetitive code out of our need base. So we'll need less coders as machine learning and someone can replicate or duplicate code within applications to make it easier. But as well in the sense of it does, start helping us think about this changing landscape. But again, is the other side of the coin is how much easier this makes the use of it. So the increased use of it means that it also widens the kind of application that we could use this for in our various tools, and specifically from an HR perspective. How do we start really utilizing AI and machine learning in our own kind of practices and processes? And obviously, this really kind of reinforces the whole concept about a skills economy, about how do we drive and build and create and also retain storylines around specific skills within the organization. So it's not so job focused, but it's the skill sets that sit behind those roles that are essential for us. It can be applied across multiple environments. And the next one I would like to speak to about predictive analysis. And I think this is probably the one that holds an enormous amount of potential for us in kind of driving key strategies and key initiatives. And here we kind of got a quote that talks about the fact that predictive models within this organization, within Targama, could predict kind of 80 to 90%. I think back to my days within the JD Group, we did quite an exercise where we could, we could predict the impact on sales based on a vacancy of a branch manager. But again, as it took months of doing research and analysis and Excel files, in a sense of how these kind of mechanisms are giving us real-time predictive ability of making changes or scenario planning within our environments. So again, what does it mean from a data perspective is how do we use data to predict and conduct scenario plannings and create those kind of correlation relationships. And then what I also think is quite exciting and scary at the same point is digital tracking, right? I mean, I even think from my own perspective of how nowadays you get a report on your PC on the amount of hours that you've used, whether it's the mouse or the PC active or continuous working, from a kind of wellness perspective, or nowadays on your screen it will tell you when you should drink water or when you should take a break or get away from the screen. Those kind of aspects and how that drives wellness, and that's probably the positive version of the story. But there's always a scary part of what does digital tracking mean, and when is it ethically not appropriate, and when is it ethically appropriate? I mean, I think for some of us, the first introduction in cameras in the workplace, I remember those initial conversations where, in what environments is it appropriate for us to be able to have a camera in the workplace, and where is it not appropriate, right? And same with digital tracking. These are going to be fundamental conversations we're going to have to facilitate as digital progression moves with our various, labor forums, workforce councils, or those kind of environments. So again, from an HR concept, really about how do we manage and hold and also protect as employee champions the employee privacy agenda. And then next to that, obviously, is in its same breath, it has fundamental opportunities from employee efficiency perspective, employee wellness ability, and how we can kind of manage and drive those kind of efficiencies in the organization and through various kind of forums and mechanisms. So a lot of potential there for what we're capable of doing. All right, so that kind of brings us close to the end. So I thought, let me just summarize some of the key kind of points and hopefully provide you with some takeaways from the session, and hope you take something away from the little bit of experiences and some of the information that I found interesting sharing with you. So I think the first to highlight or key takeaway for me is, really seeing data as an organizational capability. And I think from an HR perspective, how it's changing our role is we really do need to relook fundamentally how we see work or the kind of skill economy, and seeing data as an organizational capability, and specifically within human resources, how we see data as a key HR capability. And not necessarily that we want to turn every single HR individual into a data scientist. Understanding is that we do need that ability to understand the fundamentals. In the same point, we do need a core function that can help us build a capability from a HR perspective as well. The next is, I really think this is using the small and wide data. And I think this is really important in the sense of, looking at it from a combination of a data protection perspective, but also from a usability perspective. Oftentimes we throw a lot of data points and a lot of sort of analysis spreadsheets and dashboards and individuals, but it's really about getting back to what is the essential information we need, what are the key levers, how do we simplify this for audiences, and with all the progression we're seeing with HR and kind of data analytics from that perspective, is how do we use that to really build stronger narratives for how we go forward. Then, and I think the part I am the most excited about is the meaningful employee experience. And how do we use data to create key personas within the organization? And how do we use those personas to leverage data to help us build stronger employee journeys, but also understand critical moments within that journey, better through the data, where we're not seeing it as a collective or a whole, but we're able to see this in kind of different persona levels or difficult critical talent areas, and how we need to interpret that fundamentally differently. And then what does the big convergence mean for HR? We spoke about, smart houses, smart offices. Where is smart offices taking us, and what is our role to play in that, and how do we protect employee privacy again? While at the same point, how do we use stuff like algorithms to improve and make us more effective at recruiting and promoting and doing recognition exercises, or even employee training and development? Versus the other side is, how do we also use this convergence to help us identify bias or unfairnesses for us to be able to address? So a lot of opportunity there, and I think a key part is going to play a part of our roles as going forward. And then obviously lastly, ethics and privacy. I think this is going to be a fundamental challenge to us as a HR population, and our role is really going to be about how do we facilitate this conversation about where's the lines with what data we capture, what do we monitor, and what do we use it for, and where do we ensure that we deal with it in an ethical way while protecting the privacy of individuals and protecting them from discrimination or distrust or those kind of aspects. And then on that note, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you guys. I've now had a long time period to just throw a lot of information at you, and I think this is the perfect opportunity then to take a moment to see if you have any questions or any comments you would like to share.
Yeah, thank you, Mario, for this wonderful session. We are getting a lot of comments, positive comments, feedbacks from you. We have Charles Daniel stating that it was a great presentation and was excellent. And he has a question for you that he's asking whether he can support. Okay, can you support someone to build the human resource information system for an organization? Which application or platform is easier and user friendly for such a human resource information system to build in an organization?
I think that's a wonderful question. I think if you find the perfect one, do let me know as well. I think I've seen the application of success factors and SAP, and we've seen the production of Workday. And I think all these platforms have some amazing capability, and that's typically what we would like to see. I often find that the question is not what the right technology is our ability to use it. I think with most HR information systems through my career, I normally find we don't use it well enough, or we put poor data into the systems, and therefore we only harness about 10-15% of the capability of the technology at our disposal. So for me, it's a little bit of a two-edged sword. On one side, yeah, there's a challenge to whether there is or what is the right technology. On the other side is, I start wondering whether we even use the technology available to us to the extent of what it's capable of. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Mario. We have other questions also. And meanwhile, I'm also getting many messages in the chat box stating that the presentation was wonderful and very excellent. So we have one question from Nalka that he is asking how artificial intelligence could be used in HR management. So
yeah, I mean, a great example is, if I take both the Salesforce and Amazon example of how we use AI in a sense of shortlisting or doing the hiring process. So how to sort through data pieces, and based on specific algorithm, how it also allows us to, identify what the correct individuals or in the processes from CVs or applications, or what the most sort of suitable candidates are. So you can imagine the time it takes a recruiter to sift through 1,000 CVs to create a short list of 3 individuals. So obviously a software that has the capability or AI capability to do that is enormous. Obviously, the challenge that we haven't been able to solve out is the 2 case studies both found unfortunate bias in that sorting. And as a result, it's still not perfect, but it definitely is. It's starting to build a bit of capability for us. I mean, there's definitely options, and there's definitely some versions of it that we can start looking into.
Okay, thank you, Mario. We have another interesting question for you. Uh, the person has not revealed the name. Is asking what is the role of what role does HR officers play in conflict resolution between managers and employees, having in mind that managers of these organizations have more data on how the organization work compared to the HR officers. So I hope you got the
Yeah,
question.
I think that is fundamentally an exceptional question, and it speaks to the fact of our own data literacy. And as HR professionals, we can't be in the position to not have the access, not necessarily access to the data, being able to interpret the data. If I think about 10 years ago, or maybe even a little bit more, we spoke about our literacy for financial data, right? In other words, as an HR business partner, can you read a profit and loss statement to the same point as the business can so that you can be part of the conversation? In the same way, we now have to be able to be data literate or literate of the business to be able to read the same information and understand the same concepts. But yeah, the simple answer is yes, we do play a mediation role. And here it's really about more our communication techniques than necessarily always our data literacy capability. So it's a little bit of both. And the only tip I can give you is none of us find it easy, but it's something that we build over time.
Thank you, Mario. We have another question from Yo and Peterson. First of all, he's thanking you for this brilliant training, and he has a couple of questions, and it is his first question is there a difference between machine learning and data science? Okay. And the second question from him is, can you share some useful data science software available for implementation? And third question is, which technology do you use or could you recommend to allow organization deeply analyze their HR activities and make the right decisions?
So
you have
there's
three
some
questions.
wonderful questions. Johan, unfortunately, I'm going to disappoint you with most of them, I'm sure. But I mean, the first is there's a wonderful picture, and do put in Google and search and read up a little bit more about data science. And I know there's some wonderful, I think, certificate or courses, Krishna, through Uniathena as well. I mean, I also did the course on machine learning, which I thought very insightful. But one of the course that I went through had a wonderful picture of these circles that kind of shows that, you kind of got artificial intelligence and machine learning. And it's not that, data science is machine learning or data science is artificial intelligence, but that artificial intelligence are part of data science, but data science is much broader than just those spheres. So if that's maybe a nice way of explaining it, that they are parts similar, but in the point, data science is a bit broader than just machine learning and AI. It uses some of machine learning and AI capability in understanding or analyzing and making use of data, but they're not one and the same. So they're not synonymous with each other. Then on the software kind of question is, I really can't. I mean, this is one of those where I feel if I say one, then I'll be wrong for not saying another. I think there's such a multitude of software and capability out there. And unfortunately, no one is paying me commission to sell one of them. So therefore, I'm probably wrong for boosting one than the other. But I think there's so much out there. I think the bigger question to answer is that even a poor system is better than no system. And I think that's the bigger message.
Thank you, Mario. We have another question from Daniel. He says that it's a wonderful presentation and he would love to request the presenter he wants to know more about what is the future of HR with the emergence of technological advancement in the 21st century. So he's asking.
So I was hoping we answered it a little bit today. If not, I'm really sorry, but I was trying to say a little bit, or I think the presentation today was a little bit to indicate of what we kind of seeing with that is, it's always so hard. I mean, I think of when I was at university, which now feels very long ago, but say roughly 20 years ago, if I look at our textbook then and they had predictions for the next 10, 20 years, if I look at the content of those textbooks today, you kind of think, well, some of it was true, some of it wasn't true. So, I think the beautiful thing is every single year you'll see the predictions for the next year and the predictions for the future. So much information out there. I think none of us have a crystal ball to really tell, but fundamentally what we do know is technology is fundamentally reshifting how we work. But at the same point, the human touch and human part of the storyline is starting to become more critical. And I think that's a key part of where HR also plays, about keeping things human while also adapting from a technology perspective. I think that's the best I can tell from my glass ball.
So we are getting a lot of comments stating that the presentation was awesome.
That's
Okay.
very good.
And there's one question that how can data science help the engineering and finance sector?
So how can data science? So I honestly, I must say, I'm by far not an expert on data science, neither the engineering or sound industry. So I'm gonna skip that one if you don't mind. I think the base thing is there's opportunities for machine learning and AI to play a role with accuracy when it comes to engineering, processing improvement, time turnarounds. It's all the same kind of similar storylines, but I would probably go speak or research within that specific industries for more insights.
We have another question that from Holden. How can data management help HR managers focus more on people rather than the processes?
So again, I feel here that the answer lies in the data helps us improve our processes, yes, and that's a key fundamental part. But also from that, we get insights. And I think that's one of the fundamental shifts we need to make from getting data to improve processes to getting data to create insights. And from the insights that we're able to make more impact. And I mean, even if you think about the original story that we told, the old story of this individual that went and looked at all the data, John Gruen, I think it was, that looked at all the data records, the parishes and death records, and was able to turn that data into something meaningful in the sense of understanding life expectancies of people. So in the same way as where we start creating meaning for us, it's not just about understanding, our time to recruit or seeing data on different demographics of our workforce. How do we start translating that in predicting tenure of specific groups of individuals and specific roles? So that's really the part. So it's really about how do we take this to the next step, which we're not good at yet. So, and that's really going to be a key part of what we need to do in the future.
We are getting a lot of questions.
That's awesome.
Next question is, how can you reduce organization cost effectively using data science?
Well, I think those are synonymous with each other, right? I mean, I think data science and ability, just if you think about the example of the recruitment, right? I mean, fundamentally, if we are able to get to the right colleague quicker through a system and more cost effectively through data, in other words, it can be automated. So the key I really feel here is automation. That's really what the part that's going to help lead us into the cost efficiency drive. So so that's the one side. The other side is also what are the efficiencies we get, right? So the cost is only the one side of the coin. The other side, if I think of what machine learning can mean for us in a sense of identifying development gaps for our employees and helping them become better, there's massive opportunity in getting efficiency gain with being smarter, quicker, and faster about how do we address key questions or queries from staff.
Okay. Thank you, Mario. We have one more question. Is it possible to have hybrid integration between HR, compliance, and customer relationship management?
I have different views on it, and my view might not be the correct view. So always understand that. If I think of even I shared with the JD group, one of the things I found fascinating is we had probably one of the most amazing HR directors I've ever had the pleasure of working with. And one of the amazing things that she did is she went from just looking after HR, being the HR director, of also becoming the customer experience director for the group. So there's a lot of similarities with how we look at people from employee perspective to how we look at people from a customer's perspective. So I think these fields have a lot of similarities and a lot of differences, right? And I think there's a lot we can learn. And the one thing, for example, if I think of my time at APSA, I worked with a lot of individuals. I think it's called a CX, or customer experience kind of specialist, that, they kind of map the customer journey and look at products and services and how it impacts the customer and how it creates value for the customer. Those are definitely practices that I think HR can really make a lot more use of, as we spoke about creating this persona of different, like you would do for customers, creating different customer personas. You can do exactly the same from an employee perspective. And I think there's amazing impact we could make through that.
Okay, we have a lot more questions.
Shall we take maybe one or two more and then,
yeah.
Unfortunately.
Which are the possible career paths for HR person in this area on data analytics? Very interesting question.
Sorry, just say that again, Krishna.
Yeah, a possible career paths for HR person in the area of data analytics.
Yes, I mean, I must admit, this is where I feel very old. In the sense of when I left university, you had a career in HR. It was as simplistic as that, right? And then we used to talk about you would either you start your career in either recruitment or employee relations or learning, maybe, in the specialist kind of areas. But that was even not so common. And if you think about the operating model today and individuals joining HR today, it's fundamentally different. Most often the individuals don't walk out of university and join as HR business partners. They first start in some sort of shared services capability or something of that nature. So it's definitely changed. And I think the fascinating thing is now HR has data and data science individuals, right? So, individuals that specialize from a data science perspective on people, data, or processes or architecture and so on. So I even think from an ING perspective, we have teams of individuals that are from data scientist backgrounds in human resources that help us solve these kind of data related challenges. So yeah, it's wide open and amazing.
Thank you, Mario. Due to our time limitations, we have to wind up the Q&A session here. And I express my sincere thanks to you for this great presentation and for interacting with our learners. And I also thank our participants for their valuable feedbacks and their questions. So before winding up, I'll just like to take you with our small presentation from our Uni Athena Global Education. So we are established from 2019. Uni Athena Global Education is an edutech company headquartered in UK. We offer various online courses, both academic as well as we also offer free learning short courses, affordable and in a flexible manner. We are partnered with various universities. As you can see from our presentation, we are partnered with UCAM, Abete University, Galileo Marconi, SQA, Acacia, CMI, CIQ, etc. So these are our partnering universities. As I mentioned, we have academic programs and free short courses. So in the academic courses, we have master level programs, doctorate programs, microcredit, that is diploma certificate courses. And in the short courses, we have basic courses, which are free learning. You just need to pay for the certificates. And our mode of operation is that our highlights are, that is flexible payment. You will be paying as you progressing. Okay, it is pay for one module and then do the module and then go forward. It is 100% online. That is, we provide video materials and reading materials completely online. And it is self-paced learning platform. You can learn at your own convenient time. And we are accredited to the very best universities globally. And our courses are extended. We offer support by personal tutor. We assist either online delivery through personal tutor connection. So our courses are supported by the video lessons, and we also provide the essential reading materials. Okay. And we also have the additional reading, which are actually case journals, which link to the module that you are learning or the concepts that you are learning. So you can just go through the case studies or journal papers to know more about the course that you are learning. So you can check out our courses and its details from our website, www.uniathena.com. And for any admission details, you can connect to the admissions@uniathena.com or at fatima@uniathena.com. So thank you all for your patient listening and your participation. All the participants will receive their certificates via their registered email. And you can also revisit our website, our YouTube page, as the link has been provided in the chat box. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mario. Bye-bye.
Certificate. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Hope you have a wonderful Friday.
Bye.
Ciao.